We are here today to chat about your incredible book, Come and See the Songs of Strange Days, which in one way is sibling to this little fella here, also with Broken Sleep books, I Stand Alone by the Devils and Other Poems on Films. But this is almost sort of more than twice the length and has kind of a really energetic explosion and culmination of a lot of methodologies and styles, kind of interests of yours that I think are, it allows the book, to my mind, to sort of double up at once as a kind of mad film festival brimming with its own glorious excess and strange insight, and also a sort of reflection on a lot of your evolutions in poetic exploration up to this current point. And what I would say, having read it a couple of times, is that it feels at once like quite a large undertaking, but equally a very compelling read, a very compulsive and enthusiastic sort of kind of film festival feel to it. And I just thought I want to start off by asking you how you feel about the book in terms of where you feel it sits in regards to your quite sort of regular output. You've accrued a decent amount of stuff now that, to my count, is something like 10 poetry collections, but then if you take on board the idea of pamphlets, collaborations, art books, you're looking at a huge amount. You've got sort of 13 books of collaboration, edited 8 anthologies, 20 odd sort of limited pamphlets and other things, and these incredible asemic books which you've been working on, five or so of which are now out. Where do you see this book of yours sitting, and how does it feel to have written it?
Thank you so much for your warm words, and thank you for reading it twice. And as ever, thanks for your close attention on that. It is like a huge compliment when someone understands the context of what you're doing. So thank you, David. I see, like, my books, almost maybe just because I reveal them on my website or online in a certain way, to be in certain categories, for the very nature that they have to be, not because I necessarily want to, because obviously it's one massive exploration of similar ideas. But essentially, there's 10 books that I would consider poetry collections, and then there's, with the 2 or 3 coming out this year, there's 5, 7, 8 kind of visual poetry books, I would say, mostly asemic and handmade, and then there's another 8 or so collaborative collections, which are full collections really, but are seen in a different light, with a couple of selected, and then there's loads of ephemera. There's about 50 things I've published in my bibliography. It's about 50. And I see this very specifically in the collection area of it, not just because it is rooted in following a certain pattern and methodology after that first volume that you were very kind to bring up, I Stand Alone by the Devils, but also because it has just a different feel and a different set of concerns that I would align with what I take to be the literary poetry collection. Although obviously, as it grew and as it's now come out, it's drawing in from the other elements of my work, and it is kind of a conglomeration, almost like a one-person anthology. So I see it very, very strictly within that, like, categorization. And I connect it back to my book Fights, I would say. So I made Fights was arguably my first collection. I basically finished 3 collections in about a year when I first started, and I published them kind of all together. And they were very different: Red Museum, Minimum Security Prison, Dentistry, and Fights. And Fights was just completely naive because it was led purely by the passion I had for boxing, which I maintain. But at that time, I was obsessed with boxing. And I just wanted to find any way to get to the thing that I thought boxing was, that the other poems I'd read about boxing and the books. And I was on some radio shows. I was on the BBC talking about this at an event at the National Poetry Library about boxing. None of them got to what I think boxing is. None of them got to what I think the sport represents. And that frustration has informed a great deal of my writing and a great deal of my teaching, to get to the thing to acknowledge that there's a failure when you try and describe or show insight towards a thing that is fundamentally experiential, which again is a metaphor to the Beckettian idea of language being a fundamental failure from experience. And when you acknowledge that failure, you're then free to create poems as representations of the thing you're trying to get to, which are paradoxically more true because they're not shadowing a kind of patronizing emotional insight. So the boxing book Fights was full of screenshots and, you know, memes and hand wraps and found text and maths poems. And this was made in 2010 and published in 2011 by Via, and was just ridiculously big. They were so generous to publish a 200-page, 15-cycle collection. And boxing.
I haven't got Fights. I need to.
I have to send you a copy, and it's in 2 editions, because what I was finding is nobody in poetry really noticed. It had like lovely promo quotes by Maggie O'Sullivan and Sean Bonney, and some really, really serious, brilliant people read it and helped me promote it. Tim Atkins put it on the top 100 British poetry books of the decade and all this stuff, but nobody in poetry noticed, but boxing fans did. And so I was getting emails from boxing people who were like, oh, you're the only person who would know what Michael Katsidis, the boxer, said to this other boxer behind the scenes. There was like quotes from Cornerman and stuff. Anyway, I re-released it in 2015 in a new edition, which was much thinner. And I realized in this process that you can lead a collection by its method, or you can lead it by its subject. And when you lead it by its subject, the method becomes secondary. And that secondary nature allows you a freedom to play around ideas. And it's taken me 10 years, because it's been exactly 10 years since I released that, to come back to the same concerns, but without naivety, with you know, quite a huge, you know, amount of time invested in various methodologies and how they interact, what they do, and what we should use them for. Because, as you know, one of my great passions is to say to poets in the Anglophone world, you shouldn't just choose what you write about, you should choose how you write it. Whereas most poets, there's one way, and they only care about what they're writing about. Well, we should all worry about how we write it, because there's a million ways. So I see Come and See the Songs of Strange Days as using film and my passion for cinema, which I know we share, as a way to Trojan horse or front load methodological experimentation into one firm, cohesive concept, because the collection is going to take people's eye to the film, the most passive of mediums. So people are, oh, I like 13th Warrior. And then hopefully there's an osmosis of this methodological ambition. So when I look at the book, I'm so happy with it as a physical object. Aaron has done an incredible job at Broken Sleep, but also to me, it feels like a 10-year cycle coming full circle.
Wow. I mean, there's a lot in that. And I at one point you described it as a one-person anthology, which I think is fantastic, because there is this sense of a sort of exuberant splintering out of the possibilities of those methodological concerns, but also of the different books that you have written. And because my introduction to your work was Red Museum, which sounds like it was kind of ambitious in a different way to Fights, which sounds more kind of generously inclusive and open in terms of what you were using in it. I found Red Museum like a kind of darkened labyrinth where I couldn't have any hope of properly peering into and remembering every strange dark corridor of its possibilities.
I think you're the only person who's read it.
I'm a big fan of that book because I love that, and I haven't seen it much in contemporary UK poetry, when there is a kind of ability to get lost in the book in a way that is not waiting for you to catch up or to hold your hand, but is instead tunneling deeper and deeper into an uncompromising obscurity that is actually its own passion and attention. And for that, I love it. And I wonder whether, in a way, that this idea of the 10-year cycle and coming back to approach some of those driving forces of the kind of vast inclusivity and the piling together of debris and this kind of enthusiastic flotsam of knowledge, and the kind of getting lost which I see in Red Museum, that the Come and See the Songs kind of, yeah, begins to call back to that in a really interesting way. I hadn't really thought of it in those terms. So
I think that Red Museum was the only collection I've done which I see as a failure of what my intention was, whereas all the others I look back and I'm like, this is one of the things I'm happiest about. I think I've told you this story. It was from meeting Anselm Hollow, who was a huge influence on me, and I organized the last reading he ever gave before he died, just afterwards. And I got to know his daughter, and I went and I found almost every single one of his books that I could. And I read them back to back through this man's whole life. And at that point, I was going to pull back and do, what I call the debutante ball poetry collection culture, where you're like, oh yeah, I'll publish every 3 years max, just so that the publisher feels like I'm theirs. There's nothing wrong with that. But I realized through Hollow, that's not the point. You're always going to be disappointed in the book unless you understand that you need to be satisfied with your own process first, your own interest second, and also the concept. And with Red Museum, I set out, lost working at the British Museum, to record what I saw as the, almost like the continental philosophical project of the late 20th century, which is to undercut the central notion of truth and therefore provide other truths. And the museum provided one kind of truth on the labels and on the layout, and it's unseen, and they do a great job of that. And I'm not criticizing the museum in the quite banal way that people do when they take it out of historical context, because I worked there for 7 years. I was talking about how many different versions there are of history that people seem to just relax right into. But I went too far down the rabbit hole. So I find it unreadable now because it's just this big bellicose. I mean, it appears to people who have a scholarly bent and a similar interest, which is why I very kindly, I sent it to Ian Sinclair to help me blurb and promote. And he did, because I was like, well, Ian will understand what I'm trying to do. But I look back at it, and if I had just made it 80 pages and cut out a lot, it would have been a nice work. But I think it's 200 pages of like unbelievably dense research of me sitting in the museum, searching through things. And what I realized is with fights, there was a naivety because of my love of boxing, where I felt if I wrote a similar kind of like high bellicose, ambitious poetry, the boxing aficionados and fans would find it silly. And that naivety, yeah, insufferable, which is true anyway of everything I've ever done. But what I've realized in the cycle is that my biggest, the overall goal of writing is getting in touch with your own idiosyncrasy. It's self-knowledge and the pursuit of stripping down the barriers that make you worried you're going to embarrass yourself, or your instinct is fuzzy, or you play to the gallery. No really interesting artist ever played to the gallery. And there's a lot of that going on now for a lot of reasons. And what I realized, and what I've tried to do in Come and See the Songs of Strange Days, is just not get in my own way when I have a stupid idea or a good idea together. Like, you can have a sense of humor, you can be naive, you can be clumsy. That's part of the trash aesthetic, the collage mentality, the real experimental vibe. It's just not being too polished. When that polish comes off, you can smell it. At Red Museum, I was too polished, but everything else I've done since, no one can accuse me of that. And Come and See the Songs of Strange Days is even more so. It's like, it's a car crash, but a really lovely looking one, like a really lovely car. No one gets hurt. It's like a Range Rover, and it goes into like something soft. So yeah, it's connected to that and the 10-year cycle. We've been in lockdown for a year. I've been archiving all my work. My website got archived by the British Library. I've been backing up all my videos, and I've been thinking, do I want to keep writing? Do I want to keep doing poetry? I've been indoors for a year like everyone, and I have thought back to the start and tried to learn from that. So in a way, the book is the product of that.
Wow. Again, like, there's a lot of potential avenues I could kind of pick up on there. It's something that, I guess, two things I'm interested in. apart from the third, which was an image of the car crash, which immediately I was thinking about your Greenaway poems and Z and Two Noughts and that sort of thing. I was thinking of that. But failure and naivety, the way that you looked at Red Museum and its failings, made me think of how you were talking at the beginning of this discussion about a kind of shadowing approach, whereby getting to know how we see a thing, how a thing is felt, there's this kind of inevitable failure in the language. And if you can embrace that failing, what that allows, and how you can kind of then live in that disjunctive kind of tension between what is meant and what is said, or what is tried for and what is achieved. And I wonder, I think the reason for me that I quite liked Red Museum, and not to keep going on about that because we're going to come back to Come and See the Song of Strange Days, is that there is something of failure which I think is not, I didn't apprehend it as such, but I think in terms of long poems and poems that go beyond their means, there is a kind of sense that you are going to have to finish it without completing it. You're going to have to start it without beginning it. It's something that extends its gracious flab beyond the waistline of those structures, and in a sense kind of allows for that failure, or perhaps builds into it an inevitable failure. I think a lot of the long poems that, you know, the famous sort of modernist long poems, or more recently, serial poems and longer projects, always have a sense of failure to them, you know, because there's this sense of, I wanted to say everything. And, you know, there's an impossibility. It's like that kind of notion of intelligence as knowledge. You know, you're using the finite to chase the infinite, you know, our lifespan to look for the knowledge which is infinite. And so I think there's something about that failure which I also find brave. And I think in your naivety, or at least your ability to allow the intuitive or the instinctive to take over at the expense, say, of polished aesthetic, which may be playing more to the gallery. That's something I found in Come and See the Strong, in this book, in a way that was really appealing, because I think what that does in your poetry, and this takes me on to another point about accidents, is it's very empowering. It gives a sense of the permission to include and to kind of disrupt in ugly means this idea of pleasurable language or crafted language.
Let's break that down a little bit, because that, you know, there's some big things there. With Red Museum, I remember Alec Newman, and bless his heart, Alec Newman. I mean, what an amazing person he's been for a generation of British poets already who supported me. I remember him replying saying, oh, it reminds me a bit of Bill Griffiths, and it's conceptual and it's got a touch of the language poetry. It's language poetry. And I remember not knowing what those three things were. I didn't know who Bill Griffiths was. I didn't know what conceptual poetry was. And I didn't know what language poetry was. And so the failure of Red Museum is a good failure. If it hadn't come out with two other collections, which I didn't know was unusual and I didn't know was bad by the traditional way, then I wouldn't be happy with it. But when I look back, I realized I didn't know nothing. And I was working at the British Museum. I was reading books on the occult and history and false histories. And I was just splurging. I was just eating through. It was a good mistake. It's a mistake where the other two I don't think are. I love the other two. But that one is a mistake. But it's a good mistake, because if I think back and I'd have waited a couple of years and gone on a course or got into one of these writing groups and studied and been like, here's my poem, The Museum, you know, my whole life would be different. And fundamentally, the good thing about that, connected to what you just said very generously, is the lesson I learned in that then and now is a life lesson, something that actually is in my daily life, something I'm worried about all the time. Why do I write? What's the point? How is it making my life better? How do I feel more content? Failure and not being too clever is good. I've met so many academics and so many very well-known writers. I've had the privilege of being in spaces that weird poets normally aren't, and they aren't normally at an advantage as humans. You know, they're not. And so being messy and failing and being a bit stupid and naive and making decisions in this book where at times I would do a poem, I'd come back to it the next day and I would laugh out loud at how stupid I thought it was. And I'd be like, that's in. That is in. That is the funniest thing I have done in a while. And then the next poem I'd craft and I'd like play with it. It's just, it made me happy. And I think anyone who gives my books attention, they normally have a proper reaction. It's just not many people do in the grand scheme of things. I'm fine with that. I would rather have that than the other. So when I look back to Red Museum and I think about that ebullience, that naivety, it's my juvenilia. It's good. It's a good mistake because I was living it. It's a very lived book. I was in the museum all day picking through labels. It's cool. I wouldn't ever look at it again, and I'd love to cut it into ribbons and do a new version, but I don't want to bother Alec with that. Who cares? But it definitely has been a process, because I didn't, after those books, then think, I know what I'm going to do now. I published lots of very literary books and lots of books that were unusual. People, I remember meeting people after I'd done those books, and I published a book like when I published Enthusiasm in 2015, and because of the brilliant work of Jess Chandler and co, that book got around to a lot of places. And then when I published Guide to Being Bearaware, which is basically all post-war European literary poetry, I remember a couple of people going, oh, I heard you wrote a normal poetry book. So people always have these expectations and these things are what you're going to do. And for me, though, it was all personal. Why am I doing it? Just because it feels like that's the thing I'm doing, I'm learning. I'd say it's only now, around the books I'm publishing last year and this year, it's been a good run. I'm actually consolidating the lessons. So Come and See the Songs of Strange Days is special to me in that regard, because the past, they were real accidents. If you'd have been talking to me before the book came out, I'd be like, I think it's going to be the best book and everyone will like it. And I know what I'm doing. Whereas now the difference is I'm like, oh, this is niche. I know that some people are going to open up some of these poems and be like, okay, yeah, that's in the language tradition. And then the next page is a photoshopped coffee mug with the face of a gorilla. They're going to be like, what is going on? So I know now I'm doing it. And that's the best one can hope for. Just know what accidents you're making to, you know, like Ballard's novel, I'm deliberately crashing.
Right. That's a really wonderful kind of overview of like not only poetic development, but how you reconcile that development with parts of sanity and expectation as well. I like that idea of, you know, this is going to be huge. I can't wait for the hardback volume.
Yeah. This is going to go into a second edition. Everybody loves this. I mean, I've been there. I've been in that space where I'm like, no, this one's going to crack through. I mean, last year when I did, I will show you The Life of Mind on Prescription Drugs, Dostoevsky, want to be really well known. You know, Isabel Weidner's novel done really well. It's about prescription drugs. This is a really issue. You just have to understand. You know, I think that's the difference. Can you keep working? And I think the reason why I don't have a problem with that is because I did loads of jobs before I started in poetry. It's because that's true of you're the one. You and Dennis Cooper like it. That's all right. To me, that's the thing in life in general. Can you keep going? You know, if you want to. And what I like about Come and See the Songs of Strange Days is I'm still going, eh? There's no lack of energy in this book after 10 years. Honestly, I feel now happier writing poetry than I've felt ever.
That's wonderful. I think there's something that you've struck on in your asemic work that has almost like unleashed another vitality in your poetry as well, which it is very much about that enactment. It's not about the description. It's not about the kind of aboutness. It's really the muck of making the poem a happening and a spatial event. And I guess something else that you were saying in amongst all these various convolutions of what has been said was, no, it's okay.
You phrase it like it's a bad thing.
It's a beautiful thing. It's okay. A bad thing. It's a bad thing for my like flailing somnambulant memory down the little corridors of Dave brain. You know, these little failing synapses that are squeaking into the abyss. what the hell was I saying? Yeah.
Well, I think there's something I would say to that as well, is like the asemic stuff. I remember when I Fear My Best Work Behind Me came out, and it was just after I put out Guide to Being Bear Aware. And one of the people who's a well-known person, I won't say who, in poetry anyway, was like, "Oh, I heard you did a normal book." And I went, "Well, you haven't seen my other book. It's because I've done a book of mad, handmade, visual, asemic stuff that I'm free now to write whatever I want. If I want to write a sonnet, or I want to write a literary, if I want to just betray my own ideals and write a first person patronizing emotional poem about a thing everyone knows about but I know a little bit more about, I can do that now, because I'm also later that afternoon taking some ink and squishing it on a paper and just making it thing. So that's a huge thing I say to people I work with and I collaborate with and students. It's complementary. You're freed up by that. So I think the asemic thing, you're very kind to notice. It's not asemic that's changed my work. It's the fact that when I do that, I get the mad, brutish part of me out in the art poetry, and I'm left with a more of a literary sensibility for the poetry because it's out of my system. It's the same way that performing, you know, I performed 80 times in 2016 and 70 in 2017. That energy, your book becomes different. You know that yourself. So I think that's an important thing that you're kind enough to observe. You know, these things are in a universe and people just find one part of it, and that's cool. Yeah. But it affects what you're doing as a whole. And maybe this book is different because it's bringing a lot of that together, eh?
Yeah. Actually, that's an interesting thing you say, this idea of zoning in on one thing and kind of characterizing, oh, you've done this book, you've done that book. I remember you saying that a little bit about films when, you know, this kind of strange relationship a lot of people have with directors where they're like, oh yeah, Bergman, Persona, that or Seventh Seal or something. And something very early on into watching films, you were interested in the body of work. And, you know, that sort of going through a life's work and the continuing, rather than this kind of like the fragment stands in for the whole. You were going through that. So what I want to ask you then is, like, could you say a bit about like your relationship to film, where that began, and how perhaps it's changed in this book as opposed to I Stand Alone?
Yeah, I mean, what you're saying about going through people's back catalogue, authors, novelists, poets, filmmakers, almost no one does it. And that's a really interesting thing. You know, some other force out there in the world decides, like Nabokov, it's Lolita going for a trial, scandal and being banned, and then the rest of his works are known and are published by big publishers, but aren't really known. And I find that really interesting because when I started, I was interested in asking older poets what their life was like. I've told you this before too, to see if I wanted to do it, and they'd give me like publications. I've got Cobbings, I've got Rayworth's, I've got like Peter Riley stuff that isn't really out there. And you think, wait a minute, you'd think all of this would be out there and people would know it, but it's just PhD researchers and like a few other fanboys or girls. So basically what I wanted to learn from that is that's going to happen to me. I'm going to die with a crate full of books that no one's read. And I need to get used to that. Some of the films that you and I make are never going to get seen. Some of the performances I've done, I've got 20 views and I prepared weeks for them. You know, you have to acclimatize yourself for the understanding that a body of work is not about what people experience, but it's about what you feel. So for me, that's really important. And then film is the first art form I had anything to do with. You know, I didn't really do any creative output until I was 23, 24. I didn't see myself as a creative person. I didn't like that word. I didn't like poetry as a word, but I watched loads of films, loads and loads and loads of films. And then when I first moved to London, I got an internship with a couple of like video companies and a festival in London. And the experience was mixed, but what I learned was, to say it succinctly, which I haven't done at all in this conversation, I do apologize.
No, that was me flailing around because I was.
No, it wasn't. It wasn't. You know what I'm like. I talk. I'm terrible. Two things I realized. One, to be in film, you've got to be able to press flesh. You know, you've got to go up to someone, and I don't mind doing that if I've done something to bring to them. but I was at some of the party things, and you go up to people, "Hi, my name's Steve," and they just look at you. You know, there's something in it. So I didn't have the courage to overcome my own pride. And the second thing is, I realized at that time, without being too personal, I needed to change as a person. I was too demonstrative. I had alienated certain friends around me because of my profession doing martial arts, which requires great self-confidence, delusion. And being a film director is the worst job in the world if you don't want to be demonstrative and aggressive and singular. And I didn't. I wanted the opposite. I wanted to calm down. This conversation is deeply ironic considering how much I'm nattering, but I just want it to be much more easy to be around, relaxed. And a poet is a good profession if you don't want to be like that. So that's why I'd never really tried to be creative with film until a couple of years ago.
Which makes sense of the way that you have engaged with film your ongoing experimental documentary with Teresa Wormwood. Yes, Lekova. You appear as, well, alongside her as a kind of a character, an interlocutor for the landscape. You aren't as straightforward as being yourself or a poet, but you are a presence that feels like half natural, half performed. And then a kind of, a similar creative indirectness comes into Animal Drums as well. And also when we did the film for the Austria European Poetry Festival, you got an interesting way of blending or sidestepping categorical definition. So like you are not quite acting, not quite performing, but kind of blending and moving between these things. And I mean, there are so many ways that we could talk about this book specifically in relation to the films that are chosen, because and that doesn't necessarily segue on from what I was saying. It just
just to jump in at that, the thing is that I've never made a film alone, and there's a reason for that, because I've written one script for a film project that was did quite well, but it wasn't fun. It was. It wasn't the funnest process because it was difficult to collaborate. It's not really collaboration writing a script. It's giving something that someone's just going to do something with on order. And I was very humbled. But at the same time, when I make those other films with you, with Teresa, with Josh, with Noah Hutton, with loads of wonderful people, Yasmin Feder and Ariadne Radikour, pure collaboration is saying to the other person, your idea is better. Here's what I bring to it. I mean, real collaboration is a radical investigation of your own ego. You have to have a strong ego to do it, because you've got to be present. But you have to literally say to the person, I trust you. I mean, realistically, when we made Where Is Everyone Austria, it's kind of a lot of my ideas and a lot of my spaces and a lot of my presence. But you just had a load of footage, and I never gave you any sense of what I wanted you to be, because I trust you. And that's what collaboration is. And that's a way to make film without being too demonstrative, is to be collaborative in that way. It might change in the future, but that affected my relationship, which means then that my relationship to film is always not as a creator, really. I never really see myself making the kind of films that are featured in this book or I Stand Alone by the Devils. That I always want to be the viewer, in the same way with music, say, I always want to be the listener. I want to be the pure recipient, because as soon as you start getting into the machinery of it, like you do with film, everything changes. Your relationship to film and my relationship to film is both impassioned, but it's completely different, because you're really a filmmaker and I'm not. I'm someone who's like around film, likes it, but it's just another method to me. Whereas people like you and Teresa and Josh, you are born filmmakers. Your passion for film is also in the machinery, where I don't want that. I don't want to know how to use a camera properly.
Yeah. So, okay, one of the things that, oh my goodness, just I constantly feel overwhelmed with this, because as a film fan, like there is just so much excitable stuff to do. I want to talk about the fact that we've got Roy Andersson the trilogy, I don't know what they call it, the life trilogy, the kind of Songs of the Second Floor, the Pigeon at the end, and then You the Living in the middle. We've got this as almost a kind of a sort of structure for the book's enclosure, and then we've got everything from this kind of this energetic, adventuring, joyful sci-fi 90s sincerity that is really communicated brilliantly, I think, in a lot of these poems. There's a real earnest, almost childlike enjoyment, and
I'm a child, yes.
Yeah, I like her to play with a hand smoosh.
Almost, you're like a child.
Almost, it's like, what?
Almost like a child has been given a book.
So, what guided you in choosing these films? It's too bright. I know, it's like it's too bright.
Terrible.
Can you see here?
Oh, look at that one. I'm so happy with that one. What guided me? The pleasure of watching them. Just like yeah, you know, I didn't sit out with a plan. As you kindly mentioned, I did this book, I think in 2019 with Broken Sleep, a pamphlet, because Aaron Kent, the publisher of Broken Sleep, is a big film aficionado too, of course, features in your book Light Glyphs, and screenwriter and a big film buff. So that obviously appealed to him. They were very literary poems, quite dense, very much in that of Guy de Beraware, Wrestlers, those books I've done, which are all post-war Mayakovsky and Czesław Miłosz, those people, big influences on me. With this book, something else, as you said, methodological range, but actually in choosing the films, I was left over from I Stand Alone by the Devils with a series of films that I was like, oh, I need to do a Last of the Mohicans. I need a few more Greenaways. And it was like that. It was like a very joyful listing. And then rabbit holes, just finding things. So I wrote a Mesostic about Alice Doesn't Live Here Anymore, Scorsese's, because I love Chris Christopherson. I saw him live, so I found that. And I thought, okay, so what are similar films of that feeling, that 70s Midwest American country singing feeling that I can do other Mesostics about, and started doing research and finding one there and finding one there. So it was like that. It was just like this beautiful chain of like, oh, I'm going to watch that. We're in lockdown. I mean, it's a great thing to have that. And maybe that was a big motivation. And also behind the ambition of the book is you've got nothing to do but sit in and watch movies. So why not have a reason to do so? Quite improvised. So it's interesting when you read it and you said to me kindly, you know, a lot of 90s speculative mad. I was like, oh, really? Maybe I'm pining for my youth. Maybe it's an accidental nostalgia. Maybe it's a social commentary about how certain films now have to be so constrained by other concerns. I don't know. I wasn't really thinking about that. I was just thinking about what's a good mad film that I can get into that will give me a poem.
Yeah. Oh, and how do you think you were responding to each film? Like, it seems to change on a poem, film by film basis. It's not so much a kind of ekphrastic. It's not like, sometimes it's a response, it feels. Sometimes it's almost hard to find the link. Sometimes it feels like there's a sensibility that film and poem share. And other times it feels as though there's simply a prompt. Did it change film by film, or was there anything that you were particularly hoping to achieve with this kind of relationship between poem and film?
Yeah, I deliberately didn't want to have a methodology for that. So that's very important to me. Like I was saying earlier about stripping away the barriers towards instinct. Sometimes, I mean, almost always it began with a film, but sometimes I'd be working at a method and I'd be like, you know what, this fits this film. So, you know, and sometimes it went through multiple iterations, like Prospero's books with Greenaway, incredible film, interminable last 30 minutes. I had like this poem written down and it was evolving as I was watching the film, because most of the time I'll watch it with a notebook and then I'll type that up and I got to the last 30 minutes and he was killing me. And I was like, nah, this needs an asemic for punishment. So I was just like, you know, it's just that real like indulgent feeling of like what fits where. And when I watched Last of the Mohicans and then started to put in the images of the weapons as this symbology, then I went and watched Heat to follow up Last of the Mohicans to remember whether it was good or not. And oh my God, it's good. It's not just good, it's really good. And then I was like, okay, well, I've got Native American war weapons in Last of the Mohicans and the black heart that Wes Studi pulls out of the captain and all that. All right, let's see if I can find some machine guns for Heat, because there's so much chatter online about how obsessed they were with training and that they use footage from Heat to train military and police. And then I found a website called the IMDb for guns, where they tell you exactly what guns are in each film, the make, the year, the model. And then I found on those websites, they had JPEGs of the exact gun that Al Pacino's using. I'm like, after the War Club, now I've got the gun. So that there's all this like touching and pairing and playing and manipulation of method, because for the first time in the past year, I really feel like I'm hitting a stride of understanding what with how, you know.
Yeah.
It's not systematic, but you have an instinct. But most people talk about the instinct of poetry with the words. You know, I felt like if I asked you the question, why did you put one word after another in one of your poems? You'd be like, I don't know. I mean, I was flowing. It just sounds better. It's always, I say that to my students a lot. Anyone who tells you different, it's bullshit. It's bullshit. It's just someone who's good at poetry and art is a person who's got brilliant instincts and knows how to edit. So it was just a flow, you know, because then we get into things like ordering and stuff. Why do you put one poem before another? What is the collection itself in that regard? No one teaches how to order a poetry collection. You know, these things are really interesting to me.
Well, given that sort of sense of a kind of coinciding the content with the methodology and feeling there's a kind of instinctive relationship there, what was this an intensive period of writing and of watching, or was there also some reading involved? Were you reading things at the time that you think inflected this, or before that inflected this particularly? I wonder whether that's linked to your kind of...
There definitely was for the last volume. So I Stand Alone by the Devils. They did a load of research on Fassbinder, on Herzog, on New German Cinema, on Bergman, on Greenaway. As you know, I've tried to meet Greenaway quite a few times. And I was doing a lot of research. And I felt that's what made that pamphlet quite literary and quite dense linguistically. So with this, it was the opposite. I finished a big project in like last autumn. I had loads of notes for this. I had tons of drafts, fragments. I had a vision for it, but I was waiting. And then I had to move my festival and make films. And I had such a great time working with you and working with all the poets in the European Poetry Festival. But when that finished in November, December, I went bananas on this book. I was doing like 8-hour days in my studio, watching movies, watching YouTube clips, but there was no reading research and there was no literary influence. It was just, you know what, I'm jealous sometimes that other art forms, when I've worked a little bit in theatre and when we make film, it's embodied. It's so energizing, you know. I realized for the first time this year in lockdown why I've not written novels and probably will never write many. I don't want to be indoors all day. I do not want to live my life with the curtains closed writing novels for 1,000 people or 100 people to read. And I think that with this book, I had such fun walking about, going to my studio, watching movies. It was just like a research and development project. I felt like I had a job that was actually meaningful, even though it wasn't. So it was a real burst. Yeah.
I think also that fun is incredibly palpable, and that's something that I think is encountered too scarcely often in lots of poetry. But it is that unbridled energy. It comes through. And one thing I just wanted to ask as well is, would you? And I don't know whether you'd find this annoying or not, but I loved the last poem that you've written for A Pigeon Sat on a Branch. Would you
Oh,
be able
thanks.
to would you be able to read that briefly?
Yeah, all right. It's a bit awkward, but I will. Yeah. If you close
No,
your
no.
eyes. If you close your eyes.
I've just got a candle. I'm gonna, you know.
Yeah. If you could close your eyes and just look longingly out the window. All right. So it should be said, whether or not the light is gone now. Basically, this poem has the title and the poem, and then next to it are two screenshots from Roy Anderson's films, which will be backwards. And the screenshots are the subtitles from the version. So they are not taken from the internet. That's me freezing the film, screenshotting, finding exactly the moments I want to be in the book.
Oh, were those actually from the subtitles themselves?
Yeah. So they're not from the internet. That's me watching the film closely, finding the perfect subtitle, and then screenshotting it, cropping it, and putting it in the book.
I thought these were your additions. I didn't realize that that was the actual subject. That's brilliant. That's really
and a copy is being sent to Roy Anderson because the person I work with at the Swedish embassy knows him really well, and it's in the post now. I hope he doesn't sue me because that's him really. I should have asked. But and so the last ever image of the thing is Roy Anderson's screenshot, which says, "Then the poem ends, and the poem ends." So and then the poem ends. So I mean, the presence of poetry in Roy Anderson's work is so incredibly rich. And Vallejo in Songs from the Second Floor, who is someone I did a big commission for about in Peru, where he's from, and I did a performance at Hay Festival Arequipa, where I had loads of Peruvian students, doing this mad chant in a theater about Vallejo. So Vallejo is very important to me. He's a big part of Wrestlers, the book. So when I first saw Songs from the Second Floor with Vallejo in, I was like, oh my God, this is a filmmaker who knows poems. So the first two screenshots are amazing because there's this thing going through the book, writing poetry till you went nuts. Anyway, all right. A pigeon sat on a branch reflecting on existence. Oh, long living life, birds kicking birds, cats calling cats, rats biting rats. The prize money from dead hands is a living song, a hunter in the snow, a problem of hard conscience. Oh, only so adorable or ignorable as bones before their meat, fluffing forever falling out of beds and calling it dancing. Oh, what are we doing when we move towards all our troubles, waiting for Uncle One Tooth? Oh, you cannot feel the day it is nor forgive the face paste despite yourself. I am happy to hear you are thinking fine, writing no one what to be. And finished.
But not. Does the poem end? Does the poem end? I just really enjoyed that, and I feel as though there is like a good kind of umbilical between the poem and the tone of that film, where there's a kind of deadpan existential sadness and absurdism, which is really wonderful. I love those films. Werner Attack. Also, there's so much to. I love Black Moon as well. This kind of what was the sort of punctuation or these kind of symbols?
Yeah. I was playing for a while with like a book of maths poems and fragments of stuff that I've tried to find from glitches on the internet, and it just wasn't interesting enough to do a book of. So I was left over with this Black Moon, so I just threw in the unicorn there. I don't know if you've seen Black Moon, but that is a bag of strange.
Yeah, I haven't. And on reading this and on looking it up, I was like, holy crap, how have I not seen this? This looks amazing. Like
Thanks.
Kind of strangely unicorn. Yeah.
Yeah, and it looks like Braille.
It's wonderful.
Thank you so much.
Do you, I mean, like on finishing this, like envisage some sort of wonderful parallel dimension where I could just go and watch all these films in a strange museum somewhere while also smooshing paint.
I wouldn't recommend that.
Well,
I think that your mind would pickle. Yeah, there's a couple of films in here that you recommended to me as well, like November, that brilliant Estonian film. Yeah, I think that it's come out so well, and I have to say, you know, production wise, it's just so lovely what he's managed to do. Aaron, he said it was his hardest paging ever, and I'm not surprised, you know.
Yeah, well, going forward now, just to sort of like kind of bring us to a close. Do you linger much on your books, and do you bring much of the experience of one project into the next? I mean, do you ever look back at your books at all? That's a sort of strange experience. I wouldn't know, because I haven't really done haven't written enough to kind of do that. But like, do you go back through your this year? You've had that time to reflect, I suppose, a bit more. But do you think that, for example, in your next few projects, you kind of look back upon what this meant for you, as opposed to say, like, I Will Show You the Life of the Mind, or any of the others, like Enthusiasm, Rottweiler's Guide, Nemesis, that huge collaborative book, which also is a beautiful testament. Do you draw from those as you move on, or are they very much just like a paper trail that you just keep going?
I think they're both things. I think when we publish a book, especially now in a world where so much information and language is online, we are making a statement about having a thing in the world. If we were being, you know, a bit understated, we might say it's a product. So the paper book is a thing that exists outside of us. It's a symbol. And as a symbol, I enjoy that. I mean, I think that there is something pleasing about what the book is. Historically, it is an achievement to have a book and to do something like that. It's worthwhile. I believe in that, obviously, because I've published a lot, because they do bring me joy, but I don't linger over that element of it.
Yeah.
Without being too grand, but as you said, we're wrapping up. You know, as I've got older, I've realized that things in the past I might have questioned very deeply are gifts to me, because they take up time of my existence in a joyous way without massive collapse for a meaningless or directionless life. I acknowledge that my books, like the events I organize, the films I make, the art that I make, the projects I do, the teaching I do, from one angle can be very meaningful to other people, and to me, from another can be completely pointless and will never be remembered and have no interest. And how do we even quantify that? But most of the time when I'm working on a book, I feel good. Yeah. And that's it. There's nothing else really. If someone's willing to take my work, put it together for me, publish it for me, because I've never self-published a book. I've always worked with a publisher 40 times or whatever. Then that is a kind of grace. And I wouldn't do that. I'm not a publisher. So that's it. As products and symbols, what they symbolize is that I've spent some of my time in a way that most of the time I don't think is a waste, has kept me happily occupied and stopped me from having any massive emotional catastrophes or black periods around work. Other things in life happen. So that's how I see the book, is a good distraction from how adversarial self-knowledge in existence is.
Wow. Okay. I think we can. No. That's definitely an honest and good place to perhaps leave it for today, if that's all right. We'll leave it at that bleak off note. The book
is it bleak? That's not bleak at all.
It's bleak and well, I don't know if you're saying it's a distraction from it, like in the sense that it's like life is suffering, and the absorption in the book helps me channel some sort of parallel course.
The same idea from two angles, okay? An optimist would look at the world deluded and say, oh, I'm so lucky I'm working on a book. This keeps me happy and occupied. This is what I was born to do. I don't believe that. In my heart, I'm doing poetry because of a series of accidents. If I was gardening and someone said to me, oh, the next garden show that you're working towards, the Chelsea Flower Show, how meaningful for you is that? Probably because in gardening, they don't use pretentious self-indulgent language. They just be like, of course, I'm busy with my garden. I'm excited to plant my flowers. Yeah. So I'm just saying that, like, I've ended up doing this. The book is the symbolic embodiment of me being busy with an idea. And so when I do the Zoom reading for Broken Sleep, when we have this conversation, when I publish some of these poems online, these are all iterations where if I stopped and analyzed it, it's pointless. It's a waste of time. But I'm old enough now to know, what else am I going to do? You know, is there a better world outside the door for me beyond publishing these poetry books and talking to dear friends like you? No. And that is something I've learned from people older than me, trying to be wise. And so the book becomes a symbol of me being contented. So it's not depressing. It's just acknowledging that if I didn't have any books, if no one would publish my work, there would be a gap I would have to fill with something else. And so the books mean the world to me. They are a reason of sustaining my life. They are really important, because if I didn't get books published and have projects to work on like this, and didn't have that gift from Aaron and from you in this conversation, I would have to do something else. And I would, but that's a real painful journey in life. So the book is so important, really important in what we do. It's something we can give to people. It's a gift. I'm going to give people this book. I'll send 20 of them in the post to friends, and I will keep some in an archive. I will give some to the National Poetry Library. I will help promote it so people can see it. And then I'll move on to the next one. And that is a good way to live, David, is it not? I mean, you must feel the same way making films. It's a good way to live. I'm not down on mine.
No, I
think it's hopeful. Agree.
I think what I like, what I just kind of marvel at is that you have this incredible, like, robust ability to have this kind of grounded, maybe grounded is the wrong word, but like you're saying, drawing the kind of parallel, like, well, if I was a gardener, that I'm planting this and I'm happy. That's the way that, for me, that's what contentment and meaning briefly materializes as, or continues to sustain me. And I think it's absolutely true. I just think that perhaps it's a learned or a cultural behavioral thing that I often feel reservation about being so incredibly earnest about these things. But it is at the core of what I love talking to you about, and also what I think is honest. It's not getting caught up in the kind of performed ideas of what, say, the work is about in a way that isn't real, that is perhaps postured, but is about talking about how your embodied and emotional kind of well-being interacts with the book and with the work, and how that's a very real thing. And once you take it seriously at that level and allow yourself a certain conversant honesty with that, I think it also comes out in the poems. Like, it probably makes you a more content person, but I think that's what allows the kind of like in collaboration, being able to have that strength to allow someone else to make the decisions. I feel as though that attitude towards your work allows you to smudge, to bring the accidents in and to welcome them, to accept them or to escalate them, and to just chase it for a while, rather than perhaps being caught up in how it may be perceived, how you might want to present it or whatever. I don't know. There's a freedom in that, and I admire that a lot. I think
if people can't get to that in poetry, they are lost, because there's nothing behind the curtain, right? I mean, we're not famous novelists who could pretend that it matters that 10,000 people read the book, and we're not filmmakers. If I was, maybe I would be different. But as it is, unless I make a radical change in my life with what I do, this is what I'm doing right now. I'm speaking to you, I'm writing this book. And if I didn't realistically look at my books and say they're a waste of paper in many ways, and I should have done something else, then I'm deluded, because life is adversarial. It's not depressing. Humans are aware they exist. They can only age and then they die. And the best you can hope for is a life with an absence of pain. That's not depressing. That's hopeful to acknowledge the truth of that. This is as good as it's going to get for me. I'm going to get older. I'm probably going to get less attention. There's going to be some horrible things that happen to me, and I'm happy, because the book is nothing more than it is. And I think in that admission, that's why I still do poetry, because poetry must be at the service of my existence. I will not let my existence be at the service of poetry. And that is something I've learned from people who have nothing to do with poetry. So I think you're like that, and I think a lot of people are too. And that frees me up then to enjoy this. Enjoy it, you know. Come and see the Songs of Strange Days. Never going to be reviewed in The Guardian. It's never going to be on a top 10 bestsellers list. It's not going to be seen more than 200, 300, 400 eyes in my whole lifetime. I invested my blood, sweat, and tears into it. How do I take joy from it? It was a good way to spend my life. So, and look at this, conversations are joyous. So I think that it's a hopeful position. It's taken me a long time to get to. And I do feel like it's gratefulness rather than earnestness. But I take your point.
Right. Okay. I like that change. All right.
Time
Thank
for me
you
to
very
shut
much.
up.
And with that, goodbye. Yeah, thanks, man. That was wonderful. Oh, that's creepy.
You, David, it was a joy. I will see you soon.
I will see you soon, good friend.